There is a word that both Washington and Tehran are still using this morning. That word is ceasefire. And last night, Iranian drones struck the passenger terminal of Kuwait International Airport, killing at least one person, injuring 63 more, and shutting down commercial aviation in a country that houses thousands of American military personnel and is formally classified as a U.S. ally. Both sides called it a ceasefire. One side launched drones at a civilian airport. On the surface, this looks like another chapter in an ongoing military exchange between the U.S. and Iran. But underneath, this is a story about a diplomatic structure that has already collapsed, a global energy choke point that one country now effectively controls, and a fragile economic equilibrium that could shatter at almost any moment. And most of the coverage you are going to see today will miss the most important part entirely. Because this is not a missile story. This is a Strait of Hormuz story. And the Strait of Hormuz story is, at its core, a story about everything you pay for that uses energy to exist. Stay with this, because what I'm about to show you changes how you read everything that comes next. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now and turn on notifications, because what I am about to show you is going to change how you see this entire story, and the next development in this conflict could come before this video is finished. Here is what the major networks covered. Iran launched drones and missiles at U.S. forces in Kuwait and Bahrain. U.S. Central Command intercepted most of them. One drone got through and hit the passenger terminal at Kuwait International Airport. One person was killed, 63 were injured. The U.S. fired a Hellfire missile into the engine room of an oil tanker trying to reach Iran through the American blockade. The U.S. then struck an Iranian military ground control station on Qeshm Island in what CENTCOM described as self-defense. Iran said it was a ceasefire violation. Washington said it was a proportionate response. That is the official version. The networks ran 90 seconds on the airport footage, showed the smoke, reported the confirmed death toll, and moved on to the next headline. And almost none of them stopped to connect what actually triggered this specific wave of attacks, why this specific night, and why the Strait of Hormuz keeps appearing at the center of every single exchange. Here is what most coverage missed entirely. This escalation did not begin with a drone. It began with a tanker. The Botswana-flagged vessel MT Lexi was sailing toward Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal, when U.S. forces issued warnings over a 24-hour period. The crew ignored every warning. A U.S. aircraft fired a Hellfire missile directly into the engine room. The tanker was disabled. CENTCOM confirmed this was the 6th commercial vessel disabled since the naval blockade of Iranian ports went into effect on April 13th. Within hours, Iran launched ballistic missiles toward Kuwait and Bahrain. When those were shot down, Iran launched the drone wave that hit the airport. You need to understand that sequence, because it is not random, and it is not escalation for the sake of escalation. There is a precise strategic logic to every move here, and it runs directly through the water. Now let me bring you the figure who is watching this more carefully than almost anyone in the Western world, and whose response to this conflict tells you something fundamental about the difference between reacting to a crisis and managing one. Mark Carney is not a politician who learned economics as a talking point. When the 2008 financial crisis threatened to tear the foundations out of the global banking system, Carney was governor of the Bank of Canada. And Canada emerged from that period with more institutional stability than almost any comparable economy achieved. He was then appointed governor of the Bank of England, becoming the first non-British citizen to hold that position in the institution's 300-year history. He spent 13 years as a managing director at Goldman Sachs. His doctorate in economics is from Oxford. This is a man who has sat in rooms where a single misread signal cost billions of dollars, who has negotiated with governments and central banks that held every card in the conversation, who understands at a level most politicians never reach that the most consequential moves are rarely the loudest ones. And when this war started on February 28th and oil prices began moving sharply, Carney did not hold a press conference and call for military action. He did something far more instructive. He said his government was looking at how to cushion the blow for Canadians. He directed his attention not toward the battlefield, but toward the price of a liter of gasoline in Montreal, because he understands something about this conflict that the war coverage tends to obscure. For most people on Earth, the consequence is not the drone footage. The consequence is what happens to the price of everything when 20% of the world's petroleum stops moving. That is the lens this analysis requires, and that is the frame through which everything that happened in Kuwait last night needs to be understood. To understand last night, you have to go back to April 8th. That was the day the first ceasefire was announced. a fragile two-week agreement brokered after weeks of devastating strikes launched on February 28th, when the United States and Israel began Operation Roaring Lion, a joint campaign targeting Iranian military, government, and infrastructure sites. In the first 24 hours of the conflict, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. Not partially, effectively. Traffic dropped by approximately 70 to 80%. Major global shippers, Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, MSC, suspended all crossings. Think about what that means for a moment. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 20% of global petroleum passes through it. 20% of global liquefied natural gas. Before the conflict, approximately 3,000 vessels used the strait each month. Within days of the war's start, roughly 150 commercial vessels had dropped anchor in the Persian Gulf to avoid collateral damage. That stopped approximately 15 million barrels per day of crude oil from reaching global markets. Alternative infrastructure exists to bypass the strait, but the net effective loss to global supply was estimated at 8 to 10 million barrels per day. Oil prices did not merely rise, they surged past $100 a barrel for the first time in years. The ceasefire of April 8th brought a brief reprieve. Brent crude fell below $100 when the agreement was announced. Then, within 24 hours, it surged back above $100 as investors watched the strait remain functionally closed, with Tehran requiring military approval for vessel passage. Only one oil products tanker transited the strait in the first 24 hours of the ceasefire. One. Senior Iranian officials immediately claimed the U.S. had violated the agreement's terms. The U.S. denied it, and the talks in Islamabad that were supposed to build toward a permanent resolution produced no deal. That is where this story becomes much bigger than most people realize. Because on April 13th, after the Islamabad talks collapsed, the United States did something that dramatically changed the nature of the conflict. It imposed a naval blockade. Not on the Strait of Hormuz, on Iranian ports themselves, along the entire Iranian coastline. CENTCOM announced it would intercept, divert, or capture any vessel entering or departing the blockaded area without authorization. Iran called it an act of war. Iran said it would completely block the Strait of Hormuz and activate other choke points, including the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. Oil prices jumped more than 7% on that announcement alone. Two economic blockades, running simultaneously, in opposite directions, both of them affecting the same body of water. And through all of it, both sides kept saying the ceasefire was still in effect. Wait, because what happened in the weeks that followed made everything else look different. Here is what was actually happening while the ceasefire language continued. The United States was not simply defending territory, it was running an economic siege. According to CENTCOM's own statements, by June 3rd, 6 commercial vessels had been disabled and 122 had been redirected away from Iranian ports. The U.S. blockade was, by American estimates, costing Iran $500 million per day. Iran's primary export terminal at Karg Island had already been struck earlier in the conflict. Iran's economy was being strangled through maritime enforcement, while both parties publicly maintained that a ceasefire existed. Iran, for its part, was not simply retaliating, it was holding a card that no other actor in this conflict holds. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a military objective, it is the world's most consequential energy valve, and Iran controls the eastern shore. The contrast between the two strategic approaches could not be sharper. Washington's approach, loud, visible, documented. Hellfire missiles on tankers. Videos posted to X by CENTCOM. Named ships. Confirmed kill counts. Strike footage released to the public within hours. This is pressure designed to be seen, designed to tell global markets that the blockade is real and the enforcement is real. Tehran's approach, deniable, sequential, layered. Drones that can be attributed to proxies, missiles that fail en route or get intercepted, still generating the flight footage Iran then releases publicly. Attacks on civilian infrastructure, airports, not bases, that carry diplomatic cost for the United States, regardless of whether they succeed militarily. And through all of it, the maintenance of one critical point of leverage, the shore of the strait itself. And here is the second open loop I want you to carry into the rest of this analysis. Who is actually winning? Because the answer depends entirely on what you think each side is trying to achieve. And those objectives may not be what either side is publicly saying. Now, let me give you the numbers, because the data layer of this story is where the real story lives. Brent crude at its 2026 peak, above $110 per barrel. By late May, following ceasefire optimism, it had fallen approximately 20% from that peak to around $92.56. That is still dramatically elevated from pre-war levels. That is the market pricing in a partial reopening that has not happened. 6. That is the number of commercial vessels the U.S. has disabled since the blockade began April 13th. One of them, the MT Lexi, was disabled just hours before last night's drone attacks on Kuwait. 6 disabled vessels, 122 redirected. That is the enforcement record. 63. That is the number of people injured when one Iranian drone reached its target at Kuwait International Airport last night. Not U.S. forces, not military personnel. 63 civilians, airport staff and passengers. Injuries described by Kuwait's Ministry of Health as including fractures, head injuries, cerebral hemorrhages, amputations, and injuries from explosions. One person killed. And perhaps the most important number, 20%. That is how much of global petroleum and global liquefied natural gas moves through the Strait of Hormuz in normal conditions. Pre-war, 3,000 vessels per month. Since February 28th, that number has been functionally devastated. Analysts at Rystad Energy estimated an effective global supply loss of 8 to 10 million barrels per day when accounting for the practical limits of alternative infrastructure. Even if the Strait reopened tomorrow, one senior energy analyst told CNBC that reopening would only be partial. The damage to infrastructure, refineries, and pipelines across the Gulf, combined with depleted inventories and ongoing security risk for tanker insurance, means the disruption does not simply end with a diplomatic agreement. Those numbers tell a story that no press conference does. Let me bring this out of the boardrooms and the briefing rooms. Because at some point, every geopolitical confrontation of this scale stops being about governments and starts being about people. Canadians are paying for this war at the pump. Before February 28th, gas prices across Canada averaged approximately $1.32 per liter. By early April, that figure had climbed past $1.80 per liter, a 36% increase in roughly 5 weeks. The Canadian Automobile Association confirmed that gasoline prices were nearly 30% higher from the previous month during the early weeks of the conflict. That is not an abstraction. That is families in Calgary recalculating their commute. Trucking companies in Ontario repricing every delivery route. Heating oil costs in Quebec rising as winter was still departing. In Windsor, Ontario, where cross-border auto supply chains already carry the scars of the tariff disputes with Washington, the combination of higher transportation costs and supply chain disruption from the Gulf is compressing margins that were already thin. In Saskatchewan, grain farmers are watching diesel prices push up the cost of every acre they plant. In Alberta, where the energy sector had been cautiously optimistic about the long-term positioning of Canadian oil sands as a stable supply alternative to Gulf producers, the short-term reality is a market whipsawed by ceasefire announcements and breakdown reports. Here is something nobody in the mainstream coverage is connecting clearly enough. Canada is positioned in a paradox. The same war that is raising gas prices for every Canadian household is simultaneously creating a window, a structural argument, for Canadian oil to become a more attractive long-term alternative for global buyers who cannot afford to depend on Persian Gulf supply. Senior portfolio manager Eric Nuttall at Toronto-based 9 Point Partners called the Middle East conflict a massive opportunity for Canada, citing the Clearwater Formation in Alberta alone, which holds estimated in-place oil volumes exceeding 70 billion barrels. But here is the catch. Capturing that opportunity requires infrastructure, pipeline capacity, and export routes that take years to build. The price spike is today. The strategic opportunity is years away. And the families in Oshawa and Edmonton are paying the gap right now. That closes the first open loop from earlier. The question was, why does the Strait of Hormuz matter to Canada? This is why. Canada is not a combatant in this war. But Canada is absorbing the economic consequences of every move in it. So where does this go from here? I am not going to pretend anyone knows, but I can show you the structural incentives that are already in motion. 3 scenarios. each one grounded in what we can observe. Scenario 1, managed accommodation. Both sides find a formula that allows the ceasefire language to continue while creating a practical mechanism for the strait to partially reopen. Iran gets a reduction in the naval blockade pressure, the U.S. gets nominal passage rights. Global oil prices fall from current levels. The conflict does not end, but it stabilizes at a lower temperature. Canada benefits at the pump within weeks, but Iran retains de facto control of the strait, a point former Biden energy advisor Amos Hochstein made explicitly. No matter what happens, the Iranians will control the Strait of Hormuz for the foreseeable future. It doesn't even matter what the deal says. Markets remain cautious. Insurance premiums stay elevated. The disruption never fully heals. Scenario 2, prolonged friction. The current pattern continues. Exchanges of strikes, ceasefire maintained in language only. The blockade on both sides grinds forward. Iran fires drones at civilian infrastructure. The U.S. disables more tankers. Oil prices oscillate between $85 and $110, depending on each week's news cycle. The economic cost to all parties accumulates. Canada's inflation stays elevated. The Bank of Canada holds rates tighter for longer than it otherwise would. Global supply chains adapt partially but never fully normalize. This is the scenario where nobody wins cleanly and nobody admits it. Scenario 3, structural realignment. The ceasefire breaks down completely. Iran follows through on its stated intent to fully close both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb. Oil prices breach $120, potentially higher. The disruption triggers emergency IEA reserves drawdowns. The 32 IEA member nations, including Canada, have already released 400 million barrels of strategic reserve oil since the conflict began. Markets enter genuine crisis mode. The political cost in every Western capital, including Ottawa, becomes acute. A forced resolution, not a negotiated one, becomes more likely. Canada's energy sector opportunity accelerates, but the transition period is brutal for everyone who cannot wait for it. I am not telling you which scenario wins. I am showing you what the structural incentives support, and right now, all three remain live. 1. Will Iran's decision to stop communicating with mediators represent a permanent breakdown of the Pakistan-mediated talks, or a tactical pressure move designed to force concessions before returning? Nobody knows. Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency reported the communications suspension. Trump, 3 days earlier, said negotiations were continuing. These two statements cannot both be fully accurate. 2. The Keshem Island strike last night hit what CENTCOM described as a military ground control station. Keshem is in the Strait of Hormuz. It is the critical geographic node for Iran's control of the waterway. Does last night's strike represent a deliberate U.S. escalation of targeting, beginning to degrade Iran's physical ability to control the strait, or was it a tactical self-defense response? The distinction matters enormously for what happens next. 3. Mark Carney said in April that his government was looking at how to cushion the blow for Canadians. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre argued that suspending federal fuel taxes, which could save consumers roughly 25 cents per liter, was the right response. At what point does the economic pressure on Canadian households force an explicit domestic policy response, regardless of what happens diplomatically in the Gulf? And if it does, what precedent does that set for how Ottawa navigates the next external economic shock? I do not know. Nobody knows yet. Remember the word we started with this morning, ceasefire. Remember that both sides still use it. Now sit with what we have covered. A civilian airport struck, 63 injured, 1 dead, a tanker disabled at gunpoint in international waters, a military control station destroyed on an island inside the world's most important energy choke point, and oil prices that have been elevated for 4 months with no clear path back to normal. That is what a ceasefire looks like when both parties have decided the word matters more than the definition. The Strait of Hormuz is still functionally closed. The naval blockade is still active. The drone footage is still being released. And somewhere in Ottawa, a prime minister who has spent his career reading rooms that most people never enter is watching every one of these moves, not from the outside, but from the inside of a country that cannot control what is happening, but cannot afford to ignore it either. That is what this moment looks like when it moves. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because this story is not over. It is not close to over. The next move in this conflict, the next tanker, the next drone, the next breakdown in talks could come tonight. And the economic consequences of every one of those moves is going to be felt in Canada before it shows up in most headlines. You need to have been here from the beginning when it does.